Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and major global economic and political developments that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the theme of decentralization of global supply chains. What are global supply chains? How have they become over-centralized? And what is the role of India and neighboring countries in helping to democratize and to decentralize global supply chains? That is the theme of this show. And to discuss this, I have a very esteemed expert and scholar who is joining me in the studio. Let me introduce you to him, Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja. Dr. Wignaraja is a noted economist. He is a Professorial Fellow at one of India's prominent think tanks, Gateway House, which is in Mumbai, and has also been a fellow at the ODI, an important think tank based in the United Kingdom. He's been advisor to the President of Sri Lanka and also ran the official think tank, the foreign policy think tank of the Sri Lankan government. Dr. Wignaraja, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Dr. Wignaraja, when we talk about supply chains, I mean, a lot of non-specialists, first of all, scratch their head as to what is all this about. So, if you could please tell a lay audience, what is supply chain, what is global supply chain, and what is this whole production process and the complexity of the production process under the umbrella of what we call globalization? How has this been changing?
So, supply chains are basically production over geographical space. And this is a term that probably has been around for a while, and this type of manufacturing is 100 years or so old, and it relates to something like, say, the iPhone, which I have here. People often think of this as made in America, but actually it's designed in California but made in the world. So for instance, the screen is probably made in Korea. The semiconductor chip is made in Taiwan. The keyboard is probably made in another part, such as Japan, and it's often finally assembled in China, this particular iPhone, although it will probably be now made in India in the next period to come. So we're talking about manufacturing made in the world, and what this essentially means is this production process over geographical space means parts and components have to go across many borders in order for there to be final assembly. So this makes it much more complicated than if we made this iPhone only in California, where there is no customs to take care of, there's no logistics, there's no transport by ship or by plane. And this type of manufacturing is quite sophisticated because it requires the coordination of all these different bits of the process over time and space.
And Dr. Wignaraja, when we say it is spread out over time and space, the question is, why have they been mostly concentrated in East Asia and particularly in China? And this has come to the fore when we talk about the whole diversification and the resilient supply chains and all these things which are now the talk of the town in the global economy. So, how is it that China became the centerpiece of this manufacturing and this outsourcing process, and what were the advantages that China had, because of which a lot of the Western capital poured into China for manufacturing, and because of which China became the factory of the world?
So the reasoning for China and particularly East Asia being in this supply chain is probably threefold. The first factor is that a bunch of countries from Korea to Taiwan to Hong Kong and Singapore started opening up to foreign trade and investment in the 1960s onwards by using export processing zones to promote export-oriented manufacturing. And these were basically parcels of land which had special incentives, and on top of that they benefited from very good labor at quite cheap price and very good infrastructure. And they began to open up, and this model spread from originally the 4 East Asian tiger economies to Thailand, to Malaysia, to Indonesia and others. A second very important factor was the Japan's spreading of industry out since about the late 80s. There were cost rises in Japan, wages had risen, and there was something called the Plaza Accord, which meant that Japanese exchange rate was appreciated because of a special deal with the United States. And because of rising costs in Japan, Japan started putting out its parts and components and also its final assembly in Southeast Asia. So Sony, Toyota, all of these went into Thailand, into Malaysia and countries like that. So that was a kind of a second important factor. And then the Chinese story really starts with 1978 when Deng Xiaoping opened up China to the world, having thought that the inward-oriented approach before was leading to losses for China over time, and that China could really benefit by taking capitalism with Chinese characteristics, this famous phrase.
Yeah.
And then it really got enhanced after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and China eventually became the factory of the world because it joined the World Trading System.
So now that it has become like the central node, there is a talk, Dr. Wignaraja, of a decentralized globalization. Our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, often mentions this, and many others, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, have been talking about the need to diversify and not to be over-dependent or over-reliant on China. And we have heard terms like decoupling from China, de-risking from China, and there is interestingly also a trend of reducing foreign investment into China from Western countries lately. How far this will go and whether it is going to be a full decoupling or not, I don't know, but certainly it seems like a very noteworthy trend. So if you can just talk a little bit about this decoupling, de-risking and this China plus one. This is something that's been talked about as a strategy for Western investors to spread their bets and not to be over-reliant on China.
So China, together with Hong Kong, account for about 20% of global supply chain trade as measured by looking at parts and components trade globally. This contrasts with the United States at about 8%, and the other countries in this mix really are the European Union, which has around 30% of this trade. So there is a very interesting pattern that we are seeing. Before the pandemic, in sort of 2010, 11, 12, around there, foreign investors started worrying a little bit about rising costs in China. Wages had started to rise as the supply of labor dried up. There were worries about over-regulation in China, particularly with this idea that foreign companies in China had to provide their technology, proprietary technology to China so that they could reverse engineer some of that. There were worries about red tape issues in China. And
intellectual property, yeah, like you mentioned. Yeah.
Exactly. So with these things, there was some worry, and some investors started beginning to move out into other locations. But I just should underline that China is still very much a part of this game because it is very expensive to move manufacturing capacity out of a place like China, which has become a concentrated hub. For instance, you have trained labor, which is a very important factor, and to retrain that labor in other countries will take some time. Second, you have the entire supplier network, which is in China. So often multinationals moved not just the final assembly place, but all the parts and component suppliers. So when I went back to that iPhone example, the people who make the screen, the people who make the chip, the people who make the other bits that went into this phone, these suppliers also moved, and they are located in China. So moving all of this out is very expensive to other places. And so China remains a key part of this system still, even to this day.
Yeah, of course, China remains a main player and it may not be easily dislodged. And you've written a very interesting report, Dr. Wignaraja, for Gateway House called the Great Global Supply Chain Shift from China to South Asia. And one of the points I noted was you said that it's actually in terms of profitability in the short term for multinational corporations, they will try and remain in China. But then there are more headwinds coming, and this is not so much the structural demographic or the domestic issues in China, but the global politics. And on that count, viewers, I've got a very interesting video of recent new sets of trade tariffs imposed by the Joe Biden administration, the US, against China, worth $18 billion. This is over and above the $300 billion of tariffs that were that were imposed by the Donald Trump administration on China before Biden came in. And so the US seems intent on retaliating against what they consider to be unfair trade practices of China. And this is very much linked to this diversification of supply chains. We'll come back to the diversification of supply chains, but let's first watch this video about the trade war, the US-China trade war that is intensifying.
US President Joe Biden unveiled a bundle of steep tariff increases on Tuesday. They're aimed at $18 billion of Chinese imports, including electric vehicles, computer chips and medical products. The White House cited unacceptable risks to US economic security. It said those threats came from unfair Chinese practices, flooding global markets with cheap goods. Biden will raise tariffs this year from 25% to 100% on Chinese-made EVs, among multiple other increased levies. Certain critical minerals will also go from nothing to 25%. More tariffs will follow next year and in 2026 on semiconductors, whose tariff rate will double to 50%. Tariffs on some steel and aluminium products will also take effect this year, the White House said. Official data showed the US imported $427 billion in goods from China last year and exported $148 billion to the world's number 2 economy. This trade gap has persisted for decades and is an ever more sensitive topic in Washington. Trump has floated tariffs of 60% or higher on all Chinese goods. Biden administration officials said their measures are carefully targeted and unlikely to worsen inflation. They also downplayed the risk of retaliation from Beijing. Biden has struggled to convince voters of his economic policies despite a backdrop of low unemployment and above-trend economic growth. The president has said he wants to win this era of competition with China, but not to launch a trade war. He's worked in recent months to ease tensions in one-on-one talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping. On Tuesday, China strongly criticized the US decision, and it vowed it will take resolute measures to defend its rights and interests.
So viewers, a trade war between the US and China sees no end, and in fact it could intensify even further if Trump returns to the White House next year. So what this means is that if you are investing and manufacturing in China and then trying to export to the rest of the world, you may face a lot of hurdles, because if it's made in China, then a lot of the US and also the European markets, which are the prime markets, may be closed or may be very, very expensive to export because of the high tariff barriers. I am with Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja. Dr. Wignaraja, this trade war factor and the mistrust between the two great powers, US and China, perhaps will be a spur for this further diversification that we are talking about, isn't it? And in a way, these are like non-economic factors, but you cannot ignore them, and you've been studying these as well.
So the geopolitics of supply chain shifts is really an era in our present time. President Trump at that time imposed these high tariffs on Chinese imports, and then there was a tit-for-tat trade war. And that has continued under the Biden administration. And one manifestation is not just the tariffs and issues which were kept from the Trump era, but also the CHIPS Act, which essentially provides massive subsidies for the making of semiconductor chips in the United States. I think, if my memory serves me right, it's around $38 billion dollars worth of subsidies for people to make chips in the United States, and really replace China as part of the supply chain. And also there are some restrictions in that act to stop production from the United States, high-tech production, going to China to make the chips. So they want to sort of keep the technology in the United States and make the technology and the bits that go into these supply chains in the United States. And that's the reshoring idea.
There is also now the question of the alternatives to China. I mean, you already mentioned the reshoring or the onshoring, by which the Americans are trying to bring back their investors back home and to make in America. But then at the end of the day, the logic of outsourcing will still remain, isn't it? I mean, there will be countries which are more wage competitive and which have easier conditions on taxes and other things than what we have in the US. So in that sense, they will still need to look for alternatives, right, or complements to China, which is China plus one or whatever we want to call it. So on that count, if we can now focus a little bit on our region, South Asia, you have actually written a very interesting paper that I mentioned for Gateway House, where you're talking about the possibility of make in South Asia, not just make in India. India, of course, the largest economy, but the most diverse, the most dynamic, and the fastest growing. But in this region, there are also smaller countries, neighboring countries, that could chip in and could together form a kind of a sub-regional supply chain, which could attract some of these Western investment. And this can be in manufacturing, in services, and all these fields. So why make in South Asia, and what is the role of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in particular? You've highlighted these two countries which could pair up with India and could form a kind of a trio that could wean away some of this investment that is leaving China.
South Asia's share of global supply chains is around 2%. Remember, I told you the number for China was some 20%. And bulk of that is India. So the idea is really, if India becomes a magnet for foreign investment, that foreign investment will go somewhat into manufacturing, although services are the big area. And in addition, for some of this capacity, it will go to the outer states, apart from the south and Maharashtra and Gujarat and places like that. It might begin to spill over to some of the neighboring countries. Now, there are some really interesting conditions around why investors may invest in India. One fact is India is growing very fast, 6% plus growth. A second is India has quite good macroeconomic conditions. You have 8 to 10 months of reserves in your foreign exchange, which is very interesting. Your inflation is not that high. Then you have this middle class, some people say 300 million people, which is a very important domestic market. And then there are these linkages with the diaspora who are in Silicon Valley, who are in
Gulf countries,
exactly, and also running many manufacturing companies and so on. So these advantages make India very attractive. Now, but that all said, can this wave come from China to India directly? My hunch is it will partly do so, but Southeast Asia will be the initial wave, particularly Indonesia and Vietnam, because they reproduce China in some of the conditions that are needed. For India and for the rest of South Asia, it's a matter of the business environment in the countries. And it's really about what is perceived to be by some multinationals. The regulatory barriers may be there, although India has particularly come up a lot in the cutting of red tape and regulation recently under Prime Minister Modi's administration. They've made things digitalized a lot for procedures of starting up a business and so on. But people sometimes talk about the infrastructure gaps, the cost of electricity, issues of this kind are there. Then for the regional countries, they're in two categories. You have Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, which are very natural countries that can receive some supply from those countries to India eventually, through Indian investment coming there. And this is really in textiles, in food, in things like auto parts. I think these are very complementary industries, and a little bit of IT that will go with it, particularly if we think that the new wave of manufacturing is based on services. And for those countries to really engulf and be able to participate in Indian-driven supply chains, they have to make their business environment much more friendly. And they have to cut red tape and so on. There is a second group of countries which are really Bhutan, Nepal and the Maldives, which I think are outside this picture because the costs of production in those countries are very high. For instance, Nepal is landlocked. And that means very difficult to manufacture something. So it's not competitive to do that. Everything has to be air freighted or through the land borders with India, which means it's lots of costs.
Correct.
And then the Maldives, of course, is very small. Wages are very high. Manufacturing in the Maldives would be also very difficult. And then, of course, political economy factors also why the Maldives may not be attractive to Indian investors. So South Asia has this kind of split. But I feel that India can benefit from this new wave, and it may benefit a bit more if it takes its neighbors along with it.
Right, right. And viewers, talking about India's potential, I have a very interesting video from Invest India, which is the official investment promotion agency of the government of India, highlighting India's strengths for foreign investors and why India has been a major destination for FDI, foreign direct investment, in the last few years. Let's just watch this video and continue the discussion. So viewers, India remains a bright star in the global economy. There has been a dip in inward FDI inflows in 2023-24, but it's a global phenomenon, and India's industry secretary has recently announced that we are on course to not only cross the average of $70 billion of inward FDI, but even touch $100 billion in the coming financial year. I have Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja with me. Dr. Wignaraja, so India as a dynamo that can power this whole thing, it is our dream because it also solves a lot of our domestic economic problems like unemployment and all those things. We need foreign investment, right? Investment driven growth is the key. So as an economist, coming from Sri Lanka, when you see India and its potential, you already mentioned reasons why it should be looked up to, but also its potential to bring others along. You know, we have this neighborhood first policy, and we have very strong connectivity now with Bangladesh especially. So if you could reflect a bit on India's role in the region as a kind of an elder brother, as we like to call it, and which is able to bring everyone and create those economies of scale and all those things, that will be helpful for our audiences.
So India has another huge advantage in this complicated geopolitics, and if we have a Trump presidency in the next few months in November, India will be favored, I feel, because it is not a connector country to China. India does not receive much or if any Chinese investment in this new phase. Secondly, India is not much of an exporter to China per se, and therefore the result of all of that is that it would not be seen as being a backdoor of Chinese contained products from India to the United States, and therefore it would be favored.
Not a conduit.
Not a conduit, not in the same way that Vietnam or Indonesia would be viewed in some way. So that is a big advantage. Now, as far as the neighborhood is concerned, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, I think, have the highest chance of being part of the Indian supply chain. And partly because in the case of Bangladesh, there's a very good market there, and India is already integrated through the land corridor and other things. In the case of Sri Lanka, the Indian aid a few years ago to save Sri Lanka from the domestic crisis, $4 billion were given before Sri Lanka got an IMF program, has provided India with a new trade and investment partnership. So there is a port deal done by Mr. Adani for Colombo Port, which is very important, and there is a trade agreement being discussed. India should consider a Make in South Asia program if it wants to capitalize on all this, and much better bilateral trade agreements with its partners so that it interlinks those countries very much into part of the Indian manufacturing story as the FDI begins to come in.
Yeah, and last word, Dr. Wignaraja, how far do you see the world getting rid of its China addiction? I mean, China has been like a magnet that has drawn in so much capital. Trillions and trillions have poured into China since it liberalized. When you mentioned Deng Xiaoping, over the last 45 years or so. But now with this great power clash and the West versus China fault lines, do you think India and these neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, can really capitalize on this? We have been talking about this moment to capitalize on for some time. So with reforms, you said that India needs to be more outward oriented and all these things. Do you think this is really on the anvil, and how do you foresee this 5 to 10 years down the line?
So I think there is definitely a complementary hub that will be created in Asia in addition to China, which can be there. It will take some time because China is still 20% of this globally and still a very important player, and many of the East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries are all linked into the China supply chain, right? So that model means that we will have those business relationships with us for some time. So China will probably keep increasing its links with these countries because it wants to have a strategic advantage versus the United States. And with the future of the United States, very hard to tell whether Mr. Trump will be isolationist or whether he will go for a more India-centric, Indo-Pacific type of strategy, trying to capitalize on India's market and ties with the United States. We'll have to just wait and see, but I am somewhat less pessimistic than many people about the outlook. I mean, the era of globalization, what they call hyper-globalization, which was the era from around the 2000s up to the global financial crisis of 2008, is probably over. Since the last few years we've had what they call globalization. So integration is happening, but at a slower rate. That is, trade, investment, etc. will be there.
And in more trusted clusters.
Exactly.
So viewers, I'm out of time, but I want to thank Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja for sharing all these valuable insights and also ask you to think deeper about this supply chain issue. Resilient supply chains, diversified supply chains, decentralized supply chains. You hear a lot about this, and we have tried to unpack it. And where does India stand? And where does India's commercial diplomacy, its economic engagement, its free trade agreements with other countries, and its neighborhood first policy, all these will matter a lot in making this alternative hub, as Dr. Wignaraja calls, the alternative hub to China for manufacturing. And this is still work in progress, but the signs are positive, and with a stable government back in power in India, we are very hopeful about reforms that will then unleash the full potential not only of this country but of the sub-region. Thank you, Dr. Wignaraja. Thank you so much for giving us brilliant insight into a rather technically complicated subject.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Viewers, do follow the supply chain debate, and do not be baffled by what it means. You don't have to be a specialist in economics to understand it, but because it matters to all of us. And India's own economic rise and growth and projected incline to become the third largest in the world in GDP, all of it depends very much on foreign investment and on supply chain issues. And if India gets its act together, it will be very much a substitute or an alternative or a possible complement to China. And that is what we are all looking for, because that is how we are going to create a multipolar world order as well. So everything is interconnected. The kind of globalization Dr. Wignaraja spoke about today is something that could change the fate of our country and of India's rise and its place in the world. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.